Hello, everyone. This is Professor Hamamoto, and today is the 16th of February, 2021. I'm so glad to be with you here today. Before we begin, however, let me announce that I will be on the George Webb show. I'm not sure what channel that is. I think it's Osprey, Club Osprey Group, but you might want to check into that. I'll be on tomorrow for about an hour. I should be hitting the stage around 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and I believe that's 2 o'clock, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where George Webb is based currently. And the show was put together very quickly, of course, with great deliberation by Mr. Aaron Adler. He is the executive producer. And he has a fine, excellent line producer, Andy DiBala. And it'll be just me and George Webb tomorrow talking about recent events. Of course, we'll be still sifting through the events of January 6th and the run up to that, 2021. The mischaracterized, to put it lightly, gathering on the ellipse called by President Donald J. Trump. And no doubt we'll be talking a little bit about the so-called impeachment, which failed, as you know. And in keeping with that, I should note that the First Lady, Melania Trump, has, for the first time that I'm aware of, correct me if I'm not right on this one, but she formed a office of the First Lady. And interestingly enough, is a friend of mine who I won't mention her name at this point, but she's very perceptive. She picks up subtleties, let's call them, subtleties that have huge meaning, huge importance. She pointed out, it doesn't say former First Lady Melania Trump. It does not say ex-First Lady Melania Trump. It says First Lady Melania Trump. And I'll let you speculate so far as what that implies. But if you go back maybe a couple weeks or so, maybe a little bit further than that, I did give a long talk on the role of Melania Trump, maiden name Navs, or in the Germanic rendering of the family name in the bloodlines, Knaus, Knauss. And I had understood her beyond most other people. No other person really could dug in on this one here, except for me. And I still see her as a very important player in American politics and world politics through the 4 years of the Trump presidential administration, during it, and of course, subsequent to it. I still see her as being probably more important than Donald Trump himself in moving the American Republic and the world back upon its stable axis. We're out of kilter right now, to put it lightly. We have all kinds of supposed natural disasters, including the huge snowstorm uncharacteristically, of course, in Texas. And of course, the people in the Northeast are getting socked in. And we've seen just any number of so-called natural, when I say so-called, you know what I'm implying. The people here who watch this show know about weather modification, about weather warfare, so I don't need to go into it. I'll just speak to you in terms that you understand implicitly, right? If you're a newbie, watch some other woo-woo channel on YouTube. There's plenty of plagiarists out there. But for those of you who want to take it further and want original research here, stick with me. I've got some really, really interesting and profound and important. This is not just entertainment for me. These insights that I'm going to offer you are of political relevance and importance. And I offer them only because of the importance of taking back the Republic in all spheres of life, including the sphere of human sexuality. And I gave last week a homage to Valentine's Day, approaching it from a different angle. I did not talk about directly the whole reproductive purpose of human sexuality, right? It's implicit, but perhaps I could have gone in a little bit more deeply into it. I did talk about the innovations made between the world wars, the interwar period between World War I and World War II, in the during the reign of Kaiser Wilhelm, right? The Wilhelmine Society, the Prussian Society, and all the experimentation with sexology and hormones and the endocrine system, all that, which the later Third Reich inherited all that. And very importantly, the so-called allies, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, wholesale importation of that framework. And I give you some important names that have not come up in the discussion yet. I leave the plagiarists and the wannabes on YouTube to sift through in my wake of my innovative insights of last week with Valentine's Day. So we're going to take a little bit further. And I titled this talk, Elite Deviance Sex-Pol Complex. Let me break it down because I advertise this talk as being a conflation of two very important concepts. One is, the first concept is elite deviance. Yes, I know that when it's presented to us by the social scientists and the policymakers, they always leave out themselves when they're talking about sexual deviancy and criminality, right? They're referring to the underclass. They're referring to certain minority groups, right? We know in the American historical past, certain groups were stigmatized for sexual degeneracy, deviance, and these are all loaded terms, of course. I know you know that, so please don't ding me on that. We're just going to go ahead. I had enough rhetoric policing at the university, so don't bother doing that because I'll just write you off I'll let you listen. I won't delete it, but I'll just write you off as a knucklehead. So sexual deviancy, yeah. Chinese, for example, licentious, all the early, not all of them, but a lot of the early silent films were all about these predatory Chinese men in San Francisco who were going to lure white women in particular because they were the precious group, not Mexican or other Asian groups. And this is San Francisco, right? You have all these opium dens and all this sexual licentiousness. And this is when the famous Japanese-American actor Setsua Hayakawa, who later appeared in, by the way, Bridge on the River Kwai, opposite David Nevin. That's when he really made his bones in the silent films, and he was making more money. He was a bigger box office attraction than the great Rudolph Valentino, the Sheik. So you get the point. It goes way back there. The deviance in society is always attributed to the other, right? A certain group that's being stigmatized, and but never to the elite group itself. Well, this individual, let me give you proper credit because I'm not a biter like most of the people on YouTube. His name is Professor David R. Simon, S-I-M-O-N. And the book that he has published for 9 editions, right? This book it's probably a text, or he probably uses it for his class, I'm guessing. Maybe it's in a 10th edition. In other words, he's been adding to it over the years. It's been in print quite a lot. I guess what is a later edition of the book. Oh, okay. In the back, it says, celebrating its 25th anniversary, Elite Deviance is the only text in this area that takes a holistic view as it traces the causes of elite deviance to the structure of power and wealth in the United States. So use that as part of your critical lexicon. Call it elite deviance as an homage to Professor David R. Simon. Not as an homage to him, but as an attribution, right? Just these terms do not come out of the air. And he's at the University of North Florida, which is probably one of the reasons why he had to write textbooks. He's got a huge class, no doubt, in elite deviance. He's probably a specialist. I don't know what his field the field is. It's probably sociology, I'm guessing. I don't know. So here's some of the financial fraud scams. This is on the back of the book. He talks about Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, Martha Stewart, et cetera, JFK assassination. Wow, he's a man after our own heart, isn't he, Professor Simon? Watergate, Iran-Contra, on and on. So check this out. I think I got it used. Textbooks are not cheap, but if you can get it used, because students sell them back, right, at the end of the semester or the quarter. And I even have a little bit. I'm going to put this table of contents on my patch around, so the people that support me can have an advanced look at this really fine book, I believe. And it's not something you'll find. Amazon gives you a little outline, but this is a little bit more. I scan this myself so I can refer back to it without having to locate the book, how it works. So let's congratulate Professor Simon to enriching our critical vocabulary, elite deviance. Okay, so where does Sex-Pol come from? Sex/pol. That is a conflation of two terms, sex, right, sexuality, and pol meaning politics. Interesting. Sexual politics? Wow. We Americans and people in the English-speaking world discovered sexual politics back in the 1960s. This was the counterculture time, the reviled counterculture. All you Beatles haters and all you Laurel Canyon conspiracy theorists and all the individuals who are following the intelligence, MI6 and CIA and FBI, COINTELPRO books by quote unquote authors who are defaming the counterculture. Yes, this counterculture that made a huge difference in American society and culture and world society. Let's not forget it. There's plenty of creeps in the counterculture, just like in any other age. But I think if you want to weigh the scales of losses here and gains, I think American and world society greatly benefited from the counterculture in the 1960s. And one such beneficiary happens to be Professor Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich. You might know him as the guy that does orgone therapy. I'm not putting it down. There's some merit to it. And you might relate him to alternative energy sources, free energy. But did you know that Professor Wilhelm Reich, who, by the way, left Germany prior to the Hitlerian takeover and came to the United States of America looking for political liberty and freedom of intellectual inquiry. And guess what? I'm getting ahead of myself, but he wound up in prison because of his intellectual inquiry, because of his unorthodox science. Most of you who are watching this know the backstory of Wilhelm Reich, so I won't really go into it. But most of you do not know that his whole interest in orgone, the orgone, it's this mysterious. It's not so mysterious. I believe, I'm convinced that it has a scientific basis that's been suppressed. There, I've said it. I guess that puts me into the free, quote unquote, energy camp with Nikola Tesla and all the other reviled physical scientists who are dutifully ignored in not just in the university, but by people who are exploiting their insights to great profit. And also those who want to keep us away from alternatives, right? And those people include the ones who shut off all the power in the state of Texas. Something like 60% of their oil production and generation and heating energy for heating purposes has been shut off by, who, the usual suspects. I don't want to insult your intelligence. You people have been following Agenda 2030. You know about Rosa Corey, her great work on Agenda 21. And any number of people who have looked into this. It's happening now. Now it's proof of concept that the turning off the energy will result in the I would say more than inconvenience of large numbers of people, but to the death of many. Because it's not just weather modification. We're talking about genetic modification. We're talking about modification of animal supplies for food. For those of us who do believe in eating meat proteins, which I am an advocate of, I'm not going to eat cultured meat. Sorry, thank you. I'm not going to necessarily eat a lot of pigs. I don't eat a lot of it anyway. But I'm not a steak person every week. I must have that steak and potatoes, but animal protein is important to human survival, not just for our own nutrition purposes, but for the balance of nature in general. So, well, before I stray through too far afield, let me just finish up with Professor Wilhelm Reich. He's not a crackpot. He's an important thinker, scientific thinker, and a social thinker. All right. Just like Ted Kaczynski was a brilliant mathematician, he was also he's still alive. He's a brilliant social thinker. It's very rare that you have individuals who can do both. They should be considered together, but the way we study it and understand it, there's the soft side and the hard side. Wilhelm Reich had both of them. And his innovation was talking about how sexuality is political and how political is sexual. He talks about how political regimes come to power and maintain themselves in power by controlling the sexuality of the masses, right? Isn't that what happened during the 30s? Well, 30s is an exception. That was the flapper. That was the jazz age, as people such as Fitzgerald called it. And again, for you pedantic types, I don't know if F. Scott Fitzgerald indeed used the term or the phrase jazz age. So don't ding me on it. What I'm saying is that the 1930s I care, and F. Scott Fitzgerald's name typically comes up in that context. That was a brief moment in time. After that, during the 40s and the 50s in particular, there was a clamp down in sexuality that was being exercised by the state, right, for military industrial purposes. And by the time my generation, people a few years older than me, when I was a kid, I said, oh man, I can hardly wait till I grow up. I want to be a swinger just like all these people. And of course, they whipsawed us on that. They said, okay, now you had a lot of fun. Now we're going to bring you all these engineered viruses, HIV and the rest, which I've talked about before. Once they suck you into the pleasure principle, right? Freud, yes, Freud. Let me talk a little bit. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of so much time. This is such a deep topic. It's one that I greatly enjoy. I might have to make this a 2 or even 3-parter. I don't even know if I'm going to get to Rock Hudson. Yes, the American dream. He was a dreamboat of the 1950s. We were talking about romantic comedies last week, right? We're the Millers, Jason Sudeikis, and Jennifer Aniston, who I think are probably among the top romantic comedies in American films in that genre, right? I was talking about it last week, but let's not forget Rock Hudson and Doris Day. By the way, her real name was Doris Kuploff, and she changed it because back when she was a kid, her family were getting a lot of anti-German prejudice, right? So it's all the different groups, depending on who we're at war with or we're designed to hate, right? So she had to anglicize her name to Doris Day, just like the House of von Saxe-Coburg had to change their name to Windsor, right, to make them proper Englishmen. And I'm saying this because the proximity of these different groups are much closer than we're led to believe, and it goes deeper than a simple name change. Rock Hudson, I don't believe his first name was Rock. I mean, what parents back in the early 1900s would give their child's name a Rock? I think his family name was Hudson. I forgot what his first name really was, but Rock Hudson is what we needed in the 1950s after World War II. And the movie moguls said, and they probably got together with the behavioral scientists, and they said, we need to develop an ideal American couple, right? The normative American man and woman relationship. However, because Hollywood started out as a heterodox bohemian, because we talked about the English actors that came in here during the silent era, and you also had some German Austrians that came in during the silent era in the 1930s, a little bit 40s, and even into the 50s. I.A. Diamond, for example, he was German. He wrote incredible comedies, right? For Marilyn Monroe, for Tony Curtis, for Jack Lemmon. Gentleman prefer John. He was a German immigrant to the U.S. So the point is that Hollywood, from its inception, was kinky. It was designed for the entertainment of the senses, visual, and then later, first audio and then visual, and then the sensual aspect of humanity. That's what the theater is. Theater is very sensual. Any type of public gathering is a sensual event, unless you're going to an Antifa demonstration or a conference run by academic feminists, right? Any human gathering together is sexually charged event because there are human beings there. That might be, maybe it's changing, right, as we're talking. And once they start putting in automata and hybrids and cyborgs and introducing them into the larger human population, and then eventually we'll be pushed out. But for now, it's mostly flesh and blood people who gather together in the theater. I mean, how sensual is that? You're watching Joan Crawford on the screen there, and she's a quote unquote a vamp, short for vampire, or earlier than that, really. Theda Bara was known as the vamp, those people in the silent era. And you're all sitting together in the dark, men and women together, and sometimes some children, but usually it's people who can drive there on their own steam, right? Wow. And all them pheromones going through the theater. Wow. No wonder they closed all the theaters down with the lockdown and the so-called COVID. So anyway, I'm just telling you, instead of defining or reviewing what Professor Wilhelm Reich wrote about, I'm just trying to give you a practical example of how Reich himself put together society, politics, culture, and sexuality, and said one of the reasons that his clients, because he was also an analyst, a psychotherapist. I'll get to that in a moment. You remember we talked about C.G. Jung, the Swiss psychotherapist, who's virtually a god today in the English-speaking world, and the German-speaking world, perhaps. Brilliant individual, C.G. Jung, which I'm not going to deny. But Reich, I think, has him beat so far as the importance and the implications of his work, but we don't hear that much about him unless we're talking again about the orgone energy and the orgone box and such. He put it together. Now, let me just describe why, for me, he is such an intellectual hero and a social hero, and should be a culture hero. There should be a film, a biopic made about Dr. Wilhelm Reich, and I want to write the script. Who will I cast in the role of Wilhelm Reich? I have to be a German actor. I'll have to think about that. But it should be someone who can act, not a Rock Hudson type person who couldn't act. And that was the idea. He was the boy toy of the 1950s. Oh, I forgot to mention, he was gay. Rock Hudson, I hate to bust your bubble here, but Rock Hudson, the partner of Doris Day was straight, but she was cool with it, right? But Rock Hudson was queer as a $3 bill. And, God bless his soul for that. And to his dying day, he denied he was gay, even though he was withering away before our eyes and had one of these engineered viruses that took root in his system, right? He was one of the victims of the so-called AIDS. When I say so-called crisis, we can talk about Dr. Leonard Horowitz and all the other people that have an analysis of it at another time. That's why I say so-called. So anyway, let me just briefly, because I'm already at the 30-minute point, describe to you, because this is a personal discussion as well, a revelation, why I like Wilhelm Reich. I like individuals who are outliers in general. They move the society forward. Some they move us backwards, but they're on the edge of they're on the margins, right? And I hate these so-called self-identified minority group, these aggrieved groups, these grievance I call them the pity party, right? I hate these people who got a pity party on the basis of ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, right? Or GFP, whatever the initial you are. They say we're marginalized. Hey, thank God you are on the margins. That means you have a chance to make a contribution to the larger herd. And indeed, in the case of the gay community in Hollywood and in other institutions, they have taken forward. They have pushed this either forward or back. We weren't stagnating, that's for sure. And I'm not going to pass judgment on it at this point until we get to the Lincoln Club, where, as it turns out, the head guy was trolling for teenage boys on the older, 18, 19-year-olds. This happens at the University of Iowa. It's called ephebophilia. And I saw it everywhere I looked at UC Davis, and it's all over there. And that's how the university operates, on the basis of the military / ephebophilia complex. And it's very military, by the way. I've made the connection by reading the work of Stephen Zealand. This is called The Masculine Marine. It's about gay Marines. Yeah, we're talking about Rock Hudson. Man, he was a Navy veteran of World War II. So you can be gay. You could be a warrior and a soldier and a fighter. That they're not mutually contradictory. You could also be a swish, as they're called. There's all kinds of different expressions of gay sexuality. And here's one, The Barrack Bad Boys by Stephen Zealand. And another one, Sailors and Sexual Identity. So don't tell me I don't do my homework, okay? I am a recognized authority in sexuality studies. I've said this before, sexuality, media and popular culture, and the current one, it all brings it together. New World Order theory. Sexuality is going to be one of the main areas, one of the main foci of New World Order theories, because again, the politics, the culture, the society, and the sexuality all comes together, as we're seeing in the headlines. So let me, again, pardon me for this long wind-up. The reason why I like Dr. Wilhelm Reich so much is because not only was he thrown out of the German Communist Party, he was a radical. That's one of the reasons why people in the liberal end of the political spectrum want to ignore him, because they don't think that Karl Marx has anything valuable to say. He had a lot of valuable insights, right? I'm not a Marxian, don't get me wrong. But I'm going to go into a whole critique of that. And I mention this because I hear a lot of laziness. It's Marxian, it's cultural Marxism, it's communist. These are just labels and sloppy thinking that I hear on YouTube, and these people mouthing something that they don't know about. Not that I'm an expert, because believe me, there's some people spend an entire career just studying intensely with a microscope the precious words of their God, Karl Marx. So he got thrown out of the German Communist Party, and Professor Wilhelm Reich also got thrown of the International Psychoanalytic Society. The psychoanalytic people, who was headed by Freud, he knew the great man. He was a little younger, but he knew the great man, the founder, right? And all the other guiding lights. I'm not sure if he ran into Jung, but I wouldn't doubt it. These are all cosmopolitan, world-class intellectuals that he was dealing with, Wilhelm Reich, right? So he was kicked out of the International Psychoanalytic Association for being too leftist and being too politicized, right? Because Freud, his whole school talked about dealing with psychoses and neuroses and the whole menu of problems that affected primarily bourgeois women in Berlin, right? Or Vienna, I'm sorry, if we're talking about Freud, right? That he was a Viennese. But they didn't really make a connection to the politics. But the Communist Party Association, I forgot the exact name, threw him out of the party. They banned Professor Wilhelm Reich because he was too Freudian, because he didn't subscribe to dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels, right? It's a science of society. So he got kicked out of both, and then he said, I'm going to go to America, and I already told you what happened. They threw him in prison. because he was just such an original thinker. So I have a whole bunch of notes here that I'm not going to go over because I'm running out of time. I wrote them in November 29th, year 2019. I talked about my whole encounter with Wilhelm Reich and what he meant to me. So there you go. Elite Deviance and Sex-Pol, or sexuality and politics. Okay, let me move on here. Let's talk about, let me move on to the Lincoln Project, so-called. Now, this was published today. I woke up early in the morning to find a great article by Mr. Frank Salvato in the National File. And I would recommend that you get their newsletter. I don't know if there's a subscription, but I get it in the box. And I came across this article by Frank Salvato. The headline is Lincoln Project funneled $45 million to companies owned by its founders. Okay, so this is a Democratic Party money funneling operation, right? In the guise of social justice, right? Of course. Any of these individuals who had pity parties, whether it's BLM or whatever it is, some civil rights organization, most of the mainstream ones, not the legitimate ones, but all the mainstream ones, you can just discount that, all right? Instead of sending them donations, send it to someone real, or an individual on the street. I mean, otherwise you're just you're flushing it down the toilet, as far as I'm concerned. So check out this article. Let me see some of the pertinent material here by Mr. Frank Saul. He did a great job of the reportage for the National File. Reading very quickly here. A group of high-profile never-Trumpers known as the Lincoln Project has come under scrutiny, not only for the failure of the organization's mission, credible allegations of coercing young men into having gay sex with one of the founders in exchange for jobs in politics, but also for the fact that over half the money they raised, roughly $45 million, was directed to the companies owned by the principals. And on it goes. And it gives the name of all the different individuals that worked with the late senator. And I do think that John McCain is dead. He's not living with Jeffrey Epstein somewhere. But they served as advisors to John McCain. The conservative attorney George Conway was involved. Does that name ring bells? Yes, he was the husband of the former senior advisor to President Trump, Kellyanne Conway. She's the ultimate mole. President Trump didn't have a chance. He was surrounded by moles that were just eating away at his toes. And here we were, the American people, celebrating Q and just digging the Trump triumph like it's some football game, like it's the super irritable bowel, right? We were congratulating ourselves and getting one of our guys into the office of the presidency. And all the while, the conspirators were trying all manner of means, devious and overt tactics on how to get rid of this American patriot, this person who was arguing for American sovereignty and a return to fundamental values that the elite deviant Sex-Pol complex has engineered out of us. Most of us, not all of us, right? I don't know about the younger generation, but for the baby boomers, I think we begin to lose it, believing again in our own publicity here. Okay, so let me move on to this one particular book and this one character in specific by the name of Scotty Bowers. And this was inspired by one of the comments that was made on my Facebook page. And if you want to check out the Facebook, it's under Professor Hamamoto, and I have all these different postings and links. Not a lot of the usual stuff. I don't really recirculate. This is more like the diary of what's going on in my mind at the moment that I want to share. For example, put a link to a recent 20-minute impromptu talk by Alex Jones, who lives in Texas, who's the head of InfoWars, the Alex Jones show, that really came up with a brilliant, in a very short time frame. I mean, it only happened like 24 hours before, a brilliant analysis of what really has taken place with the state of Texas and this re-engineering of the power complex, not just in the U.S. but around the world. So that's the type of links you'll find on the Facebook. But someone put a link on there with some YouTube footage of an individual by the name of Scotty Bowers, and I said, "Oh yeah, I remember Scotty Bowers. I read the book of Scotty Bowers, and this was him at giving a talk at Book Soup." I know that bookstore as well. It's in West Hollywood. Is one of the few real bookstores, independent, that remained back then. I don't know if it's still in existence. I hope it is. Even in the age of Amazon, I hope it's still around. And this is in West Hollywood. West Hollywood has a large gay population, so having Scotty Bowers there to give a talk is natural. I think he lives in the Hollywood Hills someplace. But anyway, the title of the book is called Full Service: My Adventures in Hollywood and the Secret Sex Lives of the Stars. Now, talk about a great Grove Press, by the way, 2012. Grove Press was the American publisher, so far as I know, of the mass market of Henry Miller, who wrote candidly. He was an American expat in Paris. All his really good novels were written when he was still in Paris. Once he moved to Big Sur and started becoming the Henry Miller caricature, his output, his creative insight dropped, in my estimation. So that's Grove Press. Publishers are very, very important in the taking back of the American Republic. So Grove Press published this book by Scotty Bowers with Lionel Friedberg, is probably as told too. And Friedberg probably transcribed a lot of the stories. And Bowers, he's a great storyteller, and it had the ring of truth. I have no reason to believe that he wasn't there and saw it and was active participant in the whole gay subculture of the 1950s. And the subculture of the 1950s in 2021 is now the culture. See, it became mainstream through a gradual process. And it hasn't stopped, and it's not going to stop because of that subculture that started out with organizations such as the Mattachine Society, which I hopefully will return to that in a moment, unless I go off into another one of my long extended digressions, or I prefer to call it improvisations. It became mainstream, and it's continuing to the post-human society. So even the people who identify as LGBTQ are themselves going to be rolled over. That was part of the Rockefeller plan. That was the long game that the Rockefeller endowment had when they funded people like Kinsey, Professor Alfred Kinsey, the person who was a fruit fly specialist, Drosselia, is that how you pronounce it, at the University of Indiana? That's Rockefeller. And his German counterparts, of course, with the Kaiser. I did that talk last week, so check back under that. So at the same time, you had Hollywood, who was part of this post-human process as it's unfolding, not knowing it. They were just oblivious to everything except the sensual aspect of their lifestyle, with all these rock hard bodies and these beautiful women. And couple of people, commenters, because I talked about Tracy and Hepburn were a great romantic comedy couple, and both of them were queer, right? Katharine Hepburn was a lesbian, and Spencer Tracy was bisexual. Spencer Tracy was married for I think until he died, the same woman. He was Roman Catholic, and supposedly had this romance, but it was all for public consumption. I know that. I study Hollywood history for fun. Little did I know it was going to become a professional tool of understanding the New World Order, right? Because I got it from my mother. She had all these celebrity, because she My God, she was named after Joan Crawford. My mother's name was Joan by her older sister because they all were movie freaks. So she lived it, and all these books were all over the place, all over the house, and I read them, and I was fascinated. Just she was my mother also turned me on to the National Enquirer, right? So there you go. Listen to your mother. Mother knows best, and father too. Or he used to, until he was killed off by the welfare state. So there's some great photos here. And guess what? The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, right? The person who is credited with the Windsor knot and wearing the +4s, elegantly attired, right, from the best Savile houses, right, the haberdashers, right, certified by the king himself or the queen, whatever the case may be, right? The Duke of Windsor, the elegant person who was supposed to have become the King of England, who abdicated for the woman he loves, the American divorcee Wallis Simpson, right? You know the story, or you should, right? And there's another power couple lurking around in Hollywood currently, right? You know who they are? Prince William, right? And Meghan Markle. The British crown is making another move on Hollywood. They need to regenerate it for the consumption of their generation. So the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were fixtures in the Hollywood kinky set. Remember, there are a lot of British actors that had been there by now for a generation, 20, 30 years. They knew all of them. They partied with them. They had sex with them. They played musical beds. And Scotty Bowers was there. And according to him, I don't want to spoil it for you if you want to read the book, but I thought it was funny as hell. Wallis Simpson would, at these orgies, would be bossing around the elegant Duke of Windsor, who I assume was not wearing his elegantly attired Savile Row bespoke suits, but was buck-ass naked, just like the rest of the American savages. And she would sit there and tell the Duke, yes, do that, get in this position. She'd order him around, right, in these orgies. There's a picture in the book, Full Service, of the great J. Edgar Hoover. And those of you who are watching this, you know more about J. Edgar Hoover's secret life than I ever will, even though I read all the bios, including the great one by Anthony Summers. Right, J. Edgar Hoover, he was, as they say in Britain, bent. And he was the chief law enforcement person who was kept under the control by the mafia, who had the photographs of J. Edgar Hoover wearing women's clothes, which back then would have got him thrown out of his job and he would have been a pariah. Today, they would probably promote him or make him president of the United States, right? Or the CEO of some corporation, iTunes, Amazon. You know, there's an opening now. Jeff Bezos stepped down as CEO, so maybe there's a spot for someone who's into furry fashions or whatever it is that meets their kink in their group. J. Edgar Hoover, here's the caption. J. Edgar Hoover, who I was very surprised to meet this is Bowers speaking. J. Edgar Hoover, who I was very surprised to meet in the late 1950s in some unusual circumstances. Here he is on the set of The Greatest Show on Earth with Cornel Wilde, Betty Hutton, and Charlton Heston. And one of the reasons why Charlton Heston became a butt of Hollywood later is because he was straight and he was an American and he was a Republican. Betty Hutton, I don't know what her orientation was. She's an incredible entertainer, great singer and dancer and comedic actress. Betty Hutton, check him. Cornel Wilde, I always felt that he might have been, on the gay edge, And my mother and father, by the way, used to, when we watched these reruns on TV on the family, we only had one TV back then, so everybody would be sitting on the couch, and my mother and father would talk amongst themselves when they saw a gay actor on there. And there's a Hawaiian word because they were Japanese Hawaiian Americans, so they knew the lingo of the Hawaiian people. And in Hawaiian culture, they have a social type, because this is universal. Homosexuality is universal in society, but in Hawaiian terms, the term for that is mahu. So my mother, they thinking that we wouldn't understand the context, right? Since we didn't know Pidgin English from Hawaii, we didn't know the terminology for the locals spoke there. So they would say, yeah, mahu, mahu. So they would, it was like a parlor game for them to identify who was the gay or the lesbian actresses. And I think that went around along that, mother and dad used to probably joke about it in other households, not just mine. So that's how homophobic supposedly my parents and my parents' generation were. And I say that sarcastic and ironic because they were not homophobic. This notion of homophobia has been invented by academic pity party types to aggrandize themselves and to promote their role in a already bankrupt academic system that's full of phebophiles. Are you happy now? And it's taking down the rest of the society with you towards the post-human life. So let's move on here. Let me just take a swipe at the counterculture haters, right? And let's take a swipe at all the people who claim homophobia is the big human rights issue of the last century and going into the 21st century. Because my argument, ladies and gentlemen, that LGBTQ studies or rights for certain groups who identify as that, it's redundant because they already have political, social, and enormous cultural power and have exercised it for most of the late 19th century, since the age of Victoria. I'm talking about Anglo-American society, since late Victorian society for sure, through the present. But they keep presenting themselves as a aggrieved pity party minority. Here's a case in point. Let me just take a trip back down to the 1960s. This is a documentary produced by Auntie Beeb herself, BBC, which also has a history of gay producers, actors, right? You name it, right? BBC, what could be more establishment than that, right? Check it out for yourself. Jimmy Savile comes right out of BBC, right? He was a presenter for them for many years. And everybody at the higher level administration knew about Jimmy Savile. So here's a documentary, if it hasn't been pulled down already, BBC Panorama, 2016. I even have the URL, YouTube, because, I'm an academic, right? The title of the talk is, the documentary is Music Moguls, subtitle, Masters of Pop Moneymakers. And there's a whole section in this documentary, BBC documentary, on the predominance, not the occasional, not the special circumstance of an occasional gay manager, but the predominance of gay managers in early British pop music. Remember we were talking about the boy bands last week? And I got some comment, well, I hate boy bands. All right, hate them all you want. That's not the point of hate and not hate, like, dislike. The point is, why boy bands? Why then? What is the underlying sociological and political meaning of boy bands at this time? What's the Sex-Pol meaning, sex and politics, meaning of early British pop music being dominated mostly by gay men? Well, we're talking about the baby boom generation, right? We're talking about the post-war generation. When these guys came out, most except for the royalty, I assume, but everybody else in the society were on rations, right? They didn't know what candy was for the first few years of their life. Unlike America, where we were already deep into the consumer economy. So they have people. The most famous one, and it's illustrated here. It's in the documentary, but the most famous one that I've already mentioned before is Brian Epstein. So I'm not going to belabor the point. It's there. It's mainstream. It was there, to shape the Beatles. They were kind of scruffy and look kind of like juvenile delinquents, as they were called back in the 1950s, and kind of hard, with leather. They liked the Marlon Brando motorcycle leather look. and they'd been in, in the Reeperbahn and Reeperbahn rather, and they played in really tough bars back then. So Brian, Epstein cleaned them up and made them into more looking like titty boys, which is what the preference was for. Well, actually, Brian Epstein, as I mentioned before, was into rough trade, and that's how he died. He was beat up. So here we go. Ted Heath, right, former prime minister. This is in the Daily Mail, UK. Ted Heath abused boys as young as 11. This is all old news, ladies and gentlemen. Since this article came out in 2017, we've learned about Jeffrey Epstein, and that was just kind of a throw out in our direction so that the handlers think, well, they'll have us believe that solved that problem. We got the guy. It's Jeffrey Epstein, right? No, I'm sure the people watching this know it goes deeper than that. Okay, let me refer you to another excellent documentary. I do my homework here. Remember, this is all going to be part of Professor Hamamoto's New World Order theory, the focus being Sex-Pol, sexuality. So here's a documentary that I came across. 1 hour, 38 minutes. It's titled Scotty and the Secret History of Hollywood, 2017. It's not on YouTube. You have to buy the DVD, and I have a copy of it. Thank you very much for the Patreon people. You allow me to get this research material, and I'm returning it to you in the form of these talk and more, as you will see. This is just the beginning. So it has all the different individuals who validate what Scotty Bowers is saying. They're adding their own anecdotes. People like Peter Bart, B-A-R-T. I think he was the editor-in-chief of the Hollywood Reporter for many years. He's also written some excellent books on film. One of them, I think, was about the 1960s group of the young filmmakers, like Spielberg and Lucas, and actors like Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda. And again, just set aside for now that the fact that you have been trained to hate all these people for maybe justified reasons or not. Forget that. But the title of the book is called Raging Bulls, because Robert De Niro came up this time, and Martin Scorsese. Peter Bart. So he's in this documentary. They have the British actor Stephen Fry. Excellent talent. Not only as an actor, dramatic reader. He also happens to be gay, right? Okay, he's an actor, and he wasn't closeted like Rock Hudson. And then Scotty Bowers himself is in the documentary, directed by Matt Traunauer, is the name. So this history here, the scholarship is coming out, and the whole historiographic emphasis on straight male society, I guess, is changing, because this was one of the goals of in the academic world. However, they didn't figure on the Rockefellers coming back and saying, okay, we're done with you, Professor Kinsey. We're taking the money away. Now we're moving into the next phase, which is the desexualization of the human population, sterilization, eugenics, and the fusion of animals, human beings, and computers, machine and human fusion. That's the post-human future. They've been at this for decades now. So this is what happened. And Scotty Bowers, of course, is oblivious to this process. Understandably, he was no great intellect. He was partying most of the time, or hanging out in gas stations. That's where he started, by the way. He was a grease monkey. He was a gas jockey. Back in those days, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen of a younger age, there was a man who came out at a bow tie and a uniform on, who would fill up your gas tank and would wipe your windows, right? Just listen to the lyrics of Chuck Berry, Too Much Monkey Business. And he talks about, being a gas jockey. And most of the references are lost to people these days. So that's how he would meet Johns. That's how he would meet clients. That's how he would put together people like Rock Hudson with wealthy men, and they would have these sexual trysts. That's how Scotty Bowers started out. It's a fascinating life story that was chronicled in his book as well as in this documentary. I encourage you to read both. In doing so, I also well, I've mentioned the name before. Christopher Isherwood is a screenwriter. I've been looking at some of his screenplays. One of them is Frankenstein. The movie was butchered, not the original Frankenstein, directed by James Whale, who, by the way, was also gay, but also Frankenstein as sort of a gay icon because they feel, because of their, I'll use the term, marginalization, they feel that they are not accepted in society, that they're cobbled together synthetically and put outside of the bounds of respectable society. So Frankenstein is a gay text, if you want. So is Dracula. A lot of the whole horror genre has a subtextual meaning there that most people are not even aware of, that it's about being GLBTQ, right? And of course, if you read any of the film journals, the academic film journals, it's all about, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, everything is gay from their worldview. And anything worthy of study has to have a gay subtext in academic criticism, so-called women's and gender studies. So it's mainstream. Let's see, I have a comment, a note to myself that I made way back a couple of years ago. This is right from my notes. It says, note to self, perhaps mainstream America was not in on the secret, but the Hollywood dominant culture was quite gay and lesbian. Not only the really wild sex, gambling, orgies, and pedophile events, interracial sex, and assorted unnatural acts, even by today's standards, were kept under control. So they were suppressed. They had press agents, they had news outlets, they had studio executives to make sure none of this leaked out. But today, in 2021, since we're now moving into the post-human cyborgian age, this type of activity and behavior is celebrated and is seen as desirable. How have we fallen away from the goals of the Mattachine Society? I just got this book the other day. Thank you, Patreons, for generously supporting me so I can get books like this. This book is by Michael Hone, and it embraces the Mattachine Society doctrine with a little bit of criticism, but most of all, he views the Mattachine Society as being a huge stride forward for the harassed and reviled homosexual community. And they were harassed. They were set up. They were blackmailed. They were ostracized. You could lose your job. And I'm fully behind myself, and they were formed in 1950, which is before I was born. So that goes to show you how brave these individuals were, who got together and said, we are going to create our own political movement, our own society, to protect our rights as human beings. Okay, I think most people will subscribe to that goal. And unlike the later GLBTQ movement, which became post-human, and starting in the 1960s and 70s, started to be mainstreamed, the Mattachine Society says, we just want to be everyday, average, working Joe and Jane people. We don't want any special privilege, special rights. We don't have to be flaming. We don't need our own group called the Village People. And we don't have to go about trying to convert children into homosexuality. That was the dominant theme of the Mattachine Society. Later on, and that's one of the reasons why it went out of existence, I think outside probably foundations came in and weaponized the gay agenda and saying, we're going to make it so repugnant, repellent, but also really fun and flamboyant and really flamey. So it will appeal to all of the drama that inheres in almost all human beings. We all like theater, right? We like romantic comedies. We like movies. We like musical theater. We like Life is a Cabaret, my friend. Life is a Cabaret, right? Christopher Isherwood. So it was hijacked, but that was not the original intent of the Mattachine Society. Same way with civil rights. All these liberation movements, they get hijacked by corporations eventually, and then they become denatured. They become something else. What you're seeing in the academic world has nothing to do with the original gay rights movement. It has become a tool of the globalists. So don't confuse it. Uh, let's see here. Oh my gosh, I have so much material. I'm running out of time. But let me take up next time. But before that, let me make again, Sex-Pol, sexuality, politics, right? Professor Wilhelm Reich. It doesn't get more political than this, ladies and gentlemen. This is a documentary film that came out in. It doesn't have the release date. Sorry, but it was Channel 4. Oh no, I don't have it. I'm sorry. The It's the documentary by an individual by the name of Tim Tate, Tate. You might find it on YouTube. I have a copy of it myself that I paid for. Right. The title is Secret History, subtitled Kinsey's Pedophiles, as in Alfred Kinsey, the bug doctor, the entomologist. Drosophila was his specialty. Now here's a name bringing together one repugnant, evil source current of history with another one, which is the post-human history that Kinsey himself probably didn't realize where he was leading us. Here's the name. You're not going to find a lot of material. I tried this morning. I was trying to find his doctoral dissertation in German. It wouldn't download. It was written in 1933. Who am I speaking of? I'm talking about Dr. Fritz Von Baalusak. There's a name for you that the biters on YouTube will not give you. Fritz Von Baalusak, Balluseck. He was a member of the NDSAP, the Nazi party. We call him the Nazi Party. He was also a member of the SA, the Sturm by Abteilung, I think. I'm sorry, I can't remember. My German's failing me. How am I going to read a dissertation in German in 1933? I'm going to try. So it talks about his history here. Von Baalusak, sent his diaries. He was a convicted pedophile, but I forgot that important part. He was convicted in German courts of abusing 50 children under the guise of medical experimentation, behavioral science. Right. We know about Dr. Mengele. We know about these other individuals, the University of Wisconsin and New York University and MIT and all that. This has been going on for decades. And here's a name that should be added to the dishonor roll. Fritz von Baalusak. He had sent his diaries to Alfred Kinsey himself at the Kinsey Institute, University of Indiana. Right? Now, Kinsey kept this material. He kept it under lock and key. It's probably still in the archives. I want to see these. I want to release all these diaries on all this material that's being kept from the public, the American public, who's supporting the Kinsey Institute with tax dollars. So let us file some requests to get this material out here and get the full scope of what Kinsey was up to. Kinsey refused to make the diaries available to the court. The program also interviews women abused as a child by both her father and grandfather, who believes that her father was reporting his activities to Kinsey. On and on and on again. So here you have the intersection with the Third Reich and scientists like this, pseudoscientists such as Fritz von Baalusak, and with Professor Kinsey. And guess who went to prison? Not those two, but Wilhelm Reich, who only was trying to find a cure, if that's not too ambitious of a word, for people's neurosis and their anxiety about sexuality and all the other demons that have been imposed by the church and the state and by the larger culture. That's all he was searching for. He was also trying to free humanity by exploring the sources of universal energy, real energy that could power the new civilization that he had envisioned. So he wound up in prison. Not Baalusak, not Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey is still worshipped in many circles, and his institute that bears his name is still alive and well at the University of Indiana. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go there and we're going to say, let's see the papers and the diaries of Dr. Baalusak and all the. We want to see the films too that Dr. Kinky made with all the grad students up in the attic after all the squares were sent home at one of their little dinner parties. I personally don't want to see them, but you get my point. We want to see the true archive that Kinsey was working on to create this abomination of scholarship that warped sexology as a discipline for the remainder. And a lot of people who were in the Mattachine Society were inspired by Kinsey. They viewed him as an intellectual hero, as many people still are. And it's good that scholars like Judith Reisman, who never held an academic job because of her scathing research expose into Kinsey. Judith Reisman is a name that you should check out. She single-handedly peeled back the mask of respectability for Dr. Kinsey and the Rockefeller Institute, and thereby has forced a re-understanding the whole historiography of sexology in America, and decades and decades of socialization that is leading us to this, what I believe to be the post-human world, right? Okay, I'm running out of time. I could go on, and I went over 5 minutes long. So let me pick up on Thursday. Join us tomorrow on the George Webb Show, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging in there. I hope you learned a lot, and at the same time were riveted as I am by this fascinating history of ours. Thank you very much. Stay warm. Bye-bye.